Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and another great show coming your way. It's a random series of shows this week, although this one, when I was planning it, I hadn't kind of realized it was falling on December the 7th, the 81st anniversary of Pearl Harbor, which kind of comes into our story because the events that we're talking about were occurring as a result of that event. But it's interesting that it occurred on that date. But I love this. My guest today, her website, she describes herself, Dr. Theresa Kaminski, as a historian of scrappy women. And for those of us who enjoy hearing about the brave exploits of women in World War II, referring to them as scrappy, I think, is fantastic. And a historian of scrappy women is a fantastic title. And we love talking about scrappy women in World War II. Dr. Kaminski is the author of 3 books about the Philippines, and she's joining me now. I should just say, all the links you need are in the description below. Links to my guest's websites, their books to purchase, all in the description below. And that's where you'll find everything you need. But without further ado, I'm going to bring my guest in. So good afternoon. How are you today?
Good. How are you?
I'm pretty good, thank you. So yeah, I mean, scrappy women. What drew you to writing about scrappy women? Are you a scrappy woman? And what drew you to the Philippines as your kind of specialty?
Well, I'm probably not as scrappy as the women I write about. I haven't had the opportunity to live under the kinds of circumstances that they have, which probably brought out some of their interesting tendencies. But my interest in the Philippines actually probably goes back to my father, who was in the Philippines after World War II. He was with the U.S. Army, but he was in the Philippines after World War II. And growing up, he didn't talk much about the Korean War, which is what he was engaged in. But he did often talk about his time in the Philippines, which he really, really enjoyed. And so I guess that always stuck with me. And it kind of meshed when I saw a Masterpiece Theater version of Nevil Shute's A Town Like Alice,
Neville Shute
which,
came up in yesterday's show. It's been a bit of a Neville
yeah,
Shute theme this week. Yeah.
okay. So, and by that time I was in graduate school, and I had actually never heard of that whole situation of women and children, Allied women and children, being taken prisoner by the Japanese. And I just kind of filed it away as an interesting topic. And years later, when I was looking for something to write my first book, which was Prisoners in Paradise, I thought of that again, and I did a bit of research and found, well, there was a similar thing that happened in the Philippines. And so that really kicked off my interest. And so going back, to the year 2000 when that first book was published. So I've been researching and writing about this topic for 20 years, and Angels of the Underground was my final book then. And I do want to start with a few caveats about my own expertise. I am an American historian, so I'm not a historian of the Philippines. I obviously read just about everything I could on the subject. So I do pretty well with the history, but I'm by no means an expert. That extends into word pronunciations. So I have to apologize to anybody if I'm mispronouncing something, if it sounds like screeching in your ears. It's not for lack of trying. I read pronunciation guides, I listen to pronunciations, but sometimes with my Midwestern accent, it just doesn't come out quite the way it should. And I realize we're on a channel that focuses a lot on military issues. And although I do focus a lot of my work on American women in wartime, I don't really consider myself a traditional military historian. That's another thing that for me was very much self-taught, just reading obsessively about battles and about military leaders. I think I've got it all pretty much down. So again, I hope everybody might be a little bit tolerant of any mistakes. If you find any, point
It's
them
a
out,
wonderful
you
way
know?
to be humble there. But we
Yeah.
not all of our guests are military historians. We have social historians, we have political historians, we have people who are just happy, enthusiastic amateurs. It doesn't really matter as long as people know their subject. But we'll bring up your PowerPoint, which you've come
Okay.
armed with, and tell me when to move on slides. And I always just want to add the little thing there about one of my friends, Tonet, who lives in the Philippines. You know, often one of the things that's stated about the USA is the war never hit the home soil of the USA, which technically is correct. But the Philippines, of course, is about as close to being the USA. It's all that technical thing is of the classification of countries and dominions, which is always coming up on World War II TV as how these nations talk about themselves. But it is a place where America essentially was in the forefront of the war, albeit the Philippines. But you know, it's all part of the greater USA involvement. I think it's important to remind ourselves that, as you will talk about, that American civilians were very much caught up in the war.
Right. So in this first slide, I've showed photographs of the 4 women we're going to focus on. And actually, for time's sake, of these 4, most of it will be about the women we see pictured at the top. On the left is Margaret Utinsky, usually called Peggy. And the woman next to her on the right, Claire Phillips. Below Claire is Gladys Savary, and next to her on the bottom is WWII Panlilio. So next slide, please. And this is just, again, my emphasis on geography. I love maps. So just so everybody knows where we are, and I'm sure you all do, the Philippine Islands, a huge collection of islands. And my book this time around focuses just on the island of Luzon. So even within Philippines history, this is very narrowly focused to the island of Luzon. And you can see some of the major locations there, but especially in and around Manila. That's going to be the focus of my talk. So the next slide, please. And as Paul mentioned, this all begins because of American colonization. Going back to the beginning of the 20th century, the end of the Spanish-American War, the United States determined to extend its influence worldwide and taking over control of the Philippine Islands. And this is one of my favorite photographs, I think, from the 1930s that just shows how beyond politics and the military, which the United States certainly did instill in the Philippines, but so much American business and culture, and there were strong American communities, not just on Luzon but elsewhere in the islands, and Americans were drawn to the Philippines for a variety of reasons after the Spanish-American War. So then I want to introduce each of these women in a bit more detail, and we can start with the next slide. And Margaret, or Peggy Utinsky, we see her pictured there. That photograph was taken in 1940, and she's actually with some in-laws of hers in New York. And this is, I think, one of the best pictures I've ever seen of her pre-war. On the right, we have her husband, Jack Utinsky. He's outfitted there in his World War I uniform. I've been unable to find anything much later of him. But Peggy had been born in 1900 in St. Louis, and by her own account, she was married young, widowed young, and she did have a son who turns up now and again in her narrative, but doesn't play a huge role in it. During the war, he was back in the United States. He had gone with her to the Philippines. She left the States in either the late 20s or at the very beginning of 1930. She was a registered nurse by profession, and she'd just been having a tough time making ends meet. In the 20s, she decided to go to the Philippines and just see what happened out there. She probably had a private nursing job that paid her way out there. She settled into Manila. She loved it there. It wasn't very long before she met Jack Utinsky, who was a civil engineer working for the U.S. Army on Corregidor. And if we could have the next slide. Again, the map shows you down there, highlighted in yellow, that small island. And I think everybody here knows the significance of that particular geography. The United States military and the Philippine military put a great deal of stock in the assumption that any invasion could be stopped at the mouth of Manila Bay, especially with a very fortified Corregidor Island. And Jack Utinsky was one of many Americans working on the island and working on those very fortifications. And so they got married in 1934. It was a very happy marriage. Unlike some of the other women we'll be talking about, but they had a very good life. They were pretty well off. They had servants, and it was just a nice life for them. So next slide. The other woman we'll be spending quite a bit of time talking about is, she later went by the name of Claire Phillips, but when she came to the Philippines, and this really was her name, Claire de la Taste. It does sound very much like a stage name, which ironically it was for her because she was an entertainer. She'd been born in Michigan, but grew up in Oregon. And her whole life, she wanted to be a singer and a dancer. And she tried her luck at it in various places in the States, really couldn't make a go of it. And so with a friend of hers, they decided just to see what they could do. And they headed out first to Hawaii, and then they went on to the Philippines. And when Claire arrived there in 1938, she pretty quickly found a job at a local club, basically in the chorus line, singing and dancing. It wasn't long before she met an older Filipino man named Manuel Fuentes, also a civilian employee of the U.S. military. And they quickly fell in love, got married that same year, and by the next year they had a daughter. We see Claire pictured there with their daughter Diane, but all of the information I've been able to find, including Claire's own description, Diane was adopted. This was not their biological child, but the marriage fell apart pretty quickly, and Claire said that she had asked Manuel to secure a divorce. She thought he hadn't really. She pretty much conducted herself, though, as a single woman by 1940 and 1941. So next slide, please. And this is where the name Phillips comes in. In 1941, when Claire had a job with the Alcazar Club in Manila, one of the military personnel that she met, and a lot of them came into these clubs. Manila nightlife was a huge lure for the U.S. military, was a young private, John Phillips. He was known as Phil. He was a radio man with the 31st Infantry. And they fell in love. They talked about getting married. Claire was a little bit hesitant because she was a few years older than he was, but they had this very intense romance going at the end of 1941. So next slide.
I just want to just leap in and say,
Sure.
I think some of the viewers who've watched, for example, we had James M. Scott on about a year ago talking about Rampage, the events of 1945. And of course, anybody who knows anything about World War II knows that the Philippines suffered a terrible fate as the war went on. But I think it's important to remind ourselves that in the 1930s, it was a real thriving place to be. It was like a Monte Carlo of that part of the world, wasn't it? People from all over the world. It was ambitious. There was high fashion. The architecture was modern and forward thinking. And I think it's important to remind ourselves that's the kind of location we're talking about, where people could go and start a life in a very exciting environment.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's what these four women do have in common, was that they looked at the Philippines as a way of starting over, of making something of themselves. Claire couldn't really get an entertainment career in the States, so why not go to the Philippines where um, American women were still, in a minority and very much valued for a variety of social and cultural opportunities. So, yeah, and that kind of intrepidness, that kind of scrappiness, that's what all of these women had in common. And certainly, our next woman, we see pictured here, Yai Panlilio, and Panlilio was her married name. We see her pictured there. She's the woman with all of the cameras around her chest. She had been born in Denver in 1913 to a Filipina mother. She never divulged the name of her biological father, who was Caucasian. Apparently, they may not have been married. She did grow up with a stepfather, but when she was a teenager, she married a Filipino national named Edward Panlilio, and they moved to the Philippines in 1930. And for Yai, it was kind of like coming home. Even though she'd been born and raised in the States, she welcomed the chance to go to the Philippines. And even as she was starting a family with her husband, they had three children together, she developed a career as a reporter. And she was both a newspaper and a radio reporter. She did almost all of her own photography while she was out searching for stories. And as the end of 1941 came closer and closer, she was doing a lot with the U.S. military in and around Manila, covering a lot of their stories. She had a lot of military contacts, including with Army military intelligence, particularly the S2 branch. And this was a particular interest of hers, was the gathering of information, because she knew very well that the Japanese had been developing, I guess, what could be called a fifth column. She was very aware of this. She knew what a threat it was, and she wanted to be able to help what she considered both of her countries, both the United States and the Philippines. And so our final fourth woman, Gladys Savary, born in a tiny town of Nebraska, in 1893. I think it was called Genoa, Nebraska, farming community. And from the very beginning, she wanted out. She wanted travel. And as a young woman, she did succeed in traveling just about around the world, including France, where she met a young engineer named Andre Savary. And they got married, and they ended up in the Philippines, first for his work. And then when his work contract was up and they were thinking about what to do, they decided to settle in Manila, and they opened up a restaurant. It had nothing to do with engineering, but Andre knew a lot about French cooking, and they thought that the American and European community, especially in Manila, would welcome an authentic French restaurant. They opened it up on the corner of Dewey Boulevard and Isaac Peral. So they were right near the Bayview Hotel, which still in some form is standing today. And it was a very popular restaurant in the throughout the 30s, and most people in town knew it simply as Gladys's. It was called the Restaurant de Paris, but most people just called it Gladys's, and Americans dined there a lot. In fact, probably the first three women I talked about all ended up at Gladys's at some point during their stay in Manila. So we've got them all situated here. And our next slide. And then their lives are upended, like so many others. In the States, in Europe, we talk about December 7th, but of course, for the people in the Philippines, it was December 8th. And even as people were waking up there, hearing about the bombing at Pearl Harbor, and the American military, or since July of 1941, the combined American and Filipino forces, of course, were known as USAFI, the U.S. Army Forces Far East, led by General MacArthur. There was a delay in response to this news from Pearl Harbor. There are a lot of people who've written about what caused that delay, the consequences, but basically USAFI was not as well prepared for that as it should have been. There was quite extensive bombing then that started on Luzon. The Japanese targeted Luzon beginning on December 8th, and that bombing just continued throughout most of the month of December and even into January. So for these 4 American women, they had gone to the Philippines looking for a better life, something a bit more elegant and refined, and now they were living in an active war zone. And as Paul pointed out at the beginning, these were American citizens. They're living outside of the continental U.S. They are in an American colony, but their situation is just different from other American citizens who could say, yes, the war never touched us. We were on the mainland, and nothing happened here. But these women, like the thousands of other Americans in the Philippines, couldn't say that. They experienced war directly, and I mean, all of war is horrific, but this was particularly horrific. They're living through bombing raids, and this was not an easy life for any of them. And their determination then to try and do something about this is all the more remarkable, because they knew from the beginning that they were at risk. The entire country was at risk, and they nevertheless took steps to assist the U.S. military as best they could.
And Theresa, there's a lot of talk on Twitter today, because it's the anniversary of Pearl Harbor, of how much the US or the world knew about the raid on the harbor. But we're leaving that aside, but connected to that, for these people, particularly in a bar, a hotel or a restaurant like Gladys's, people moving around the world. There's multicultural communities. In all your reading about the Philippines in that era, had there been any sense that there was a war coming, or that they were suddenly going to be in the middle of this, or was it sort of complete naivety?
No, I don't think. I think it probably hits somewhere in the middle of that.
Right.
Part of it, and again, as I said, I've been reading and researching this for like 20 years, and I'm still just amazed, because I guess my impulse is always for flight under these circumstances. But certainly, the U.S. military had made arrangements for its dependents to leave the Philippines well before December 8th. So that was a big signal. But on the other hand, the US government was unwilling to unduly panic Filipinos and make it seem like the Americans might not be willing to defend the island. So it was a very delicate balance. Certainly, Yai was very aware, because of her contacts with the military. She knew a lot about the realistic situation, and yet she was determined to stay. And Gladys Savary, especially, and her restaurant attracted a lot of military personnel. She heard a lot of officers talking about things like readiness and preparation. So she also knew a great deal. Peggy, who was on Corregidor and was watching and listening to her husband talk about all of these preparations. So all of these women knew there was a risk. They knew that there was danger. But I also think that somewhere tucked in the back of their minds was this kind of belief that, of course, the US military can't be defeated. How could it be? And it's maybe that even that small sliver of hubris that allowed them to stay. They just couldn't see that this could be a defeat. And they were proven wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so the bombing started, and here again, probably things that are very familiar, but in later on in December, the Japanese then were launching successful land invasions, Lingayen Gulf, one of the major ones, which prompted then General MacArthur to implement a long-standing plan that the U.S. military had called War Plan Orange, which called for U.S. and Filipino troops to withdraw into the Bataan Peninsula and to concentrate all their strength there, all their supplies. This involved moving tens of thousands of men, I don't know, tens of thousands of tons of supplies, food, weapons into this peninsula, again, under the assumption that with this fortification and then Corregidor, of course, just off of the shoreline there, that this would halt the Japanese invasion at least through Manila Bay. And I think, especially in hindsight, we can all see what the problems were there, mostly because no matter how fast USAFE moved, it wasn't fast enough. And they didn't really have enough supplies to last for how long that barrage, that battle, that attack from Japan would last. They simply could not hold out.
It's that era. Whenever we talk about this era, whether we're talking about Singapore or the Philippines or anywhere else, frankly, in this part of late 41, 42, it's always just a catalogue of why didn't they know about this, and no one was ready for this, and this mistake was made here and another mistake was made over there. It all seems so painfully played out now with hindsight that nothing was going to work. The supposed British Singapore plan that was clearly not going to work, and it's always uncomfortable going through this catalogue of things that went wrong, because now with all this years we can say, oh God, it was never going to work. But back at the time, this great belief that these plans were going to work and there were going to be evacuations and fleets were going to come to the rescue. It's a tragic era of World War II, and we prefer to talk about the latter parts of World War II when the Allies were winning, but these early parts when frankly nothing the Allies were doing was really going very well. It makes awkward listening sometimes.
Right, and I think a couple of things there is one that, of course, War Plan Orange probably didn't take into account having Pearl Harbor knocked out. And so I think there were assumptions then that the Philippines could be resupplied. There could be help evacuating Americans even after a Japanese attack. That couldn't happen because Pearl Harbor happened. And the other thing, of course, is geography. Japan was much closer, and Japan could afford to supply and resupply its troops much quicker and easier than the United States could. So, yeah, it is, these first years are just a litany of mistakes and losses, that were very hard to bear.
Yeah.
And finally, in an attempt to protect the civilian population, to protect the infrastructure of the city of Manila itself, General MacArthur, just after Christmas, declared Manila an open city, indicating to the Japanese that USAFE would not defend the city, hoping then that the Japanese would ease up on its attack of the city and when the occupation came, that it would be much less violent, much more orderly, and in many ways it was. Most of the people who were in Manila when the Japanese came in just after the first of the year did talk about how very quiet the streets seemed. And all of a sudden, then they saw Japanese soldiers, they saw Japanese vehicles. And so anyway, that's where we're heading then. So our next slide takes us back to one of these four women. And so what happened after Christmas of 1941? What happened when the Japanese moved into Manila in early 1942? Well, Gladys Savary stayed put at her restaurant, and here's a map. It's the best one I could find, but she was, not far from the Bayview Hotel, within visual distance of the bay. She was in the Ermita district, and she did what some of these other women we'll be talking about did. She managed to evade internment on the campus of the University of Santo Tomas. That's the other image we have there. When the Japanese occupied Manila, one of the first things their authorities did was to register Allied civilians, including the Americans, and then they started rounding them up and concentrating them into various locations. Santo Tomas was the largest concentration. Its population fluctuated during the war, but several thousand people on a university campus. And Gladys originally thought she was going to go. She was ready. She had her things packed up. And an acquaintance pointed out that under Japanese law, her nationality followed that of her husband. Now, by this point, Gladys and Andre were actually divorced. He was out of the Philippines. He actually had joined the Free French. The Japanese, of course, had no way of knowing this. They just knew he was a French national. She was able to finesse her documents to stay out of Santo Tomas, but she couldn't stay inactive. She saw a lot of need there. The American civilians who were taken onto the university grounds had only, packed suitcases that they could carry, and she had a restaurant. So she started in early 1942, making the 3-mile trip north of where she was to the campus, and essentially talking her way into the university, at least getting guards to take packages in to people that she knew. And so she was supplying civilians there with items that they needed for survival, mostly food, sometimes medicine. And she also got very adept at smuggling in contraband, things that the Japanese didn't want those detainees to have, things like news, personal notes, money. And she risked incurring the wrath of the Japanese to do this. She also began, when word reached her of American military prisoners, she had a nephew who had gone off with the 31st, I think with the 31st Infantry after Pearl Harbor. And he was a prisoner. And so she was trying to find him and trying to help other American prisoners who were housed at Bilibid prison in Manila. And again, most of this done very under the table and at risk to her safety, and to her being rounded up and put into Santo Tomas. So the next slide. the Japanese allowed Gladys to hold on to her restaurant for a few months, but after a while, they decided just to simply seize it, all of her assets, and she moved to a neighboring district in Manila, Pasay, and there she rented a house in a compound with several other allied families. One was the family of the Swedish consul in Manila. His name was Helga Jansen, and he was married to an American woman named Dorothy. And Gladys and Dorothy became good friends. They all lived together in this compound. And Jansen's standing in the diplomatic community again provided another layer of protection for Gladys. And so she could expand her contraband work, and she did as much as she possibly could. And there were times when she was stopped by the Japanese. When she was out in Manila, her papers were scrutinized, but she always managed to have an explanation for what she was doing. So she kind of dodged a lot of potentially difficult situations. So next slide. And when news of Pearl Harbor came, Yai, as a reporter, of course, wanted to get the latest news. She continued to work as a reporter in Manila even after the Japanese occupation in early 1942, and she took up radio broadcasting. One of the Manila radio stations came under, well, all of them came under the control of the Japanese, and she managed to keep her job there for a little while into the spring of 1942. The Japanese thought that they had won her over to their side. They thought she was broadcasting on their behalf. But again, because of her contacts within Army intelligence, she was trying to send coded messages over the radio while she was doing what seemed to be regular, sort of innocuous broadcasts. She was trying to, sort of funnel information through there. And the Japanese finally got wind of what she was doing. And right ahead of her arrest warrant, she managed to skip out of Manila. And she had wanted to go to Bataan. That was her original impulse after the bombing started in December, but she was blocked by the U.S. Army. They didn't want her there. She always said she could probably shoot a gun as well as anybody else could, but they didn't want a woman. So she had reluctantly stayed behind in Manila, but with an arrest warrant in her name, she hid her children in Manila with friends, and she skipped out to Rizal province, where she was just literally hiding out from day to day. And she was eventually found there later in the spring by a group of men who belonged to an outfit called Marking's Guerrillas. And this was an outfit led by Marcos Villagustin. And when they found her, they brought her to Marking, and the two of them started a personal as well as a professional relationship. Many of the men under his command referred to Yai either as Mammy or Colonel Mammy, or sometimes just Colonel. She quickly became his right-hand person. She was able to temper his impulses, and this gets into some of the dangers of guerrilla warfare in the Philippines, because every time guerrillas would strike against the Japanese took reprisals. So it was always a matter of what should you do, when should you do it. And Yai was very good at reining in Marking and being able to sort of keep his operations low key and as successful as possible. So she stayed with him through the rest of the war. Their relationship was difficult. He was a violent man in many ways. He was an abuser, and she lived with that throughout the war, and we'll come back to that near the end. But that's where she ended up, and she was very happy to be with a band of guerrillas. She believed that this was the best way that she had of showing her worth to both of her countries, was working with the Filipino guerrillas to prepare the way for what she always believed would be the eventual return of American forces.
I
So
just
that
want to
was
bring your attention back to what you said about the fact that she's had to hide her children, and she's also this voice of reason with the men around her who are perhaps more proactive and let's go out there and take revenge. I'm thinking about when Alex Ritchie was with us on Monday talking about Poland and the resistance there, and with reprisals being a reaction to anything you do. You've got to be a bit kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Is that if you're intent, you want to do something progressive, you want to do something proactive to shorten the war, to do something against the enemy, but you've got to balance it with the realistic understanding of what's going to happen if you go too far. And reprisals are a problem. And I think being a woman having children is going to keep you on that even keel of understanding risk and reward. Does that make sense to you?
I think in there were some cases where she was clearly especially concerned about what was happening, not only to the Filipinos who were supporting the guerrillas, but Filipinos who were um, in the viewpoint of the guerrillas collaborating with the Japanese, how they were treated. And you're right, I think gender and maternity played a
Mm.
role in this. I think she was often very horrified at what it meant to engage in guerrilla warfare and what those repercussions were. And especially after the Japanese implemented what they referred to as zonification, where they would, try to choke off these guerrilla groups and try to turn the local population against the guerrillas. And it was an awfully difficult situation for her to be in. So I think her struggles on many levels were very real. And again, you can see her dedication there to both of her countries for sticking it out until the very end.
Yeah, I mean, being dedicated, resistant like this, it's sometimes
Right,
as important knowing not when not to do something is as
right,
important a decision as knowing when to do something. In that you
right.
can blow everything, risk the lives of too many people around you, and so it's about balance, isn't it? And Alex took us through the same thing on Monday in Poland, which was a similar time from from there it was from 1939 to 1944,
Right.
45. You're having to balance everything with reprisals being cranked up and knowing you want to fight, you absolutely want to fight, you're determined to be a resistor, but you've got to play know when to play the game and when to not do something. But we'll move on. People are loving it, by the way.
Okay.
It's fantastic. So back to you.
Okay, so then we return our fourth woman here who also remained in Manila. Or maybe we're at three, sorry. But anyway, Peggy Utinsky. She also took advantage of the opportunity to create new identity papers. And here she capitalized on her last name, Utinsky, which was Lithuanian. And she knew Peggy didn't sound particularly Lithuanian, so she changed her first name to Rosina. And she also transformed herself into a single woman as Miss Rosina Utinsky, a Lithuanian national. Um, the Japanese would consider her part of the Axis powers, and so she would not be imprisoned. And again, I have the same map up here that I had for Gladys, because Peggy actually didn't live far from Gladys. Also in the Ermita district, she was on a street called A. Mabini Street. She rented a house. She hid out from registration, from roundup, so she could stay out of Santo Tomas. And you can kind of see on the right-hand bottom side of the map an area known as Malate. And There was a church there that was run by a group of Irish priests. We see them pictured in the right at the right there. Especially call your attention to the man who is, I think, second from the left, Father John Lawler. Um, he was one of Peggy's main contacts at the church, and the priests there opened up a hospital. It was known as the Remedios Hospital, and Peggy, as a nurse, of course, wanted to do something to help. So when she was able to stay out of Santo Tomas, she had two things in mind. One was to put her nursing skills to good work to help anybody who needed them. And there was, of course, a lot of need in Manila. And she could work very conveniently with these priests who were in her own neighborhood. So it was easy for her to get back and forth through the Ermita district to do that work at Remedios Hospital. But her second concern, of course, was to find her husband. Jack had gone off to fight after Pearl Harbor. He ended up on Bataan, and after the Japanese occupied Manila, and after the city was pacified, she also made a connection with the Red Cross, again using her fake identity. The Japanese did allow the local Red Cross to operate and to send medical teams onto the Bataan Peninsula, but they were only supposed to treat civilians there. But at the time, there were still military people on the peninsula. Peggy was hoping to find out what happened to her husband, Jack, and she actually made 2 trips onto the Bataan Peninsula during the spring of 1942. And she found enough information to know that her husband had survived the battle, but he had been taken prisoner. And if we could do the next slide. When she was on Bataan, she did make a variety of contacts with American military personnel, even though she wasn't supposed to. She took the risk, and she made some very necessary contacts that helped her to create what was known throughout Manila as the Miss U Network. And of course, this is a play off of her last name, Utinsky. And the network was established first to help the prisoners at Camp O'Donnell, and for the men who survived the death march in April of 1942. Most of them ended up at Camp O'Donnell. We see that picture there at the top, and like all of these POW facilities, the Japanese did not make many attempts to adequately take care of their prisoners. And Peggy knew from her various contacts that there was a huge need for food, medicine, supplies, anything that these men needed, she was determined to get. And when the Japanese, after a few months, closed down O'Donnell and moved the remainder of the prisoners to Cabanatuan, she similarly moved her operation there. And here is where this network was vast. Okay, and she relied on the help of those Irish priests because that was her. That was the place where she collected her materials. Donations were dropped off at the convent there. The priests helped to package it all up. She also started working out of her apartment. She had found some, and here I should make a very clear point about this as well. Her network did not run on her work alone. She had an extensive web of helpers, many of whom were Filipinos. And I should point out that a lot of this underground work, whether it was guerrilla warfare, whether it was smuggling, intelligence work, a lot of it was carried out by Filipinos. And Peggy's work would not have been possible without women like Naomi Flores, Maria Martinez, all of these women who took the same kind of risks that she did. And so she used her apartment as it was set up as a beauty parlor business, so that the Japanese wouldn't think anything of people coming and going from it. And so she had these connections then in these different places, and then out at the camps themselves, she would help collect the goods in Manila. Sometimes she would go with the shipments herself to the camps. So this was an extraordinary network that was set up, and that operated very well from 1942 into 1943. So the next slide. Okay, so the last of our four women, Claire Phillips, as she soon came to call herself, she did not stay in Manila originally. After Pearl Harbor was bombed, after the 31st Infantry was mobilized and sent into the Bataan Peninsula, Phil Phillips came for Claire and Claire's daughter Diane and said, "You'd be better off with us down in the peninsula." And so for several months, Claire and Diane were essentially following the 31st through Bataan. Claire eventually sends Diane back to Manila, thinking it'll be safer for her, and she ultimately follows later in 1942, after, of course, after the fall of Bataan, after the death march, after she finds out that Phil is in fact he's survived too, but he's a prisoner of the Japanese. And while she was on Bataan looking for Phil, well, I'll get to that in a minute. But anyway, she does eventually go back to Manila, and we can see these are actual newspaper advertisements where she had to earn a living for herself. So she did take up entertainment work, and she eventually opened up a club of her own, the Subaki Club. And this opened up in the fall of 1942. And you can see that it's designed to attract Japanese customers. The name of the club, her right-hand person at the club, Faylee, was not only a singer and a dancer, but she helped Claire with her underground work. This Manila's own Josephine Baker, probably unintentionally, she wouldn't have known what Josephine Baker also did, besides sing and dance, but Claire ends up doing about the same thing.
I was just going to make that point.
Yeah,
Ironic that she's
yeah,
referring to Josephine Baker in the sense of being an all-round entertainer. But we did a show a few months ago with Damien Lewis about his book on Josephine Baker doing exactly the same kind
yeah,
of stuff in France and other places in Europe. It's like an ironic nod
yeah.
to another hero.
Yeah, and Claire did come up with her version of a fan dance too, to delight the customers. So for her then to stay out of internment, because as an American woman she should have been in Santo Tomas, she could have relied, and she does, she as the owner of the Tsubaki Club, she uses the name Dorothy Fuentes. And that's, of course, the last name Fuentes was still her legal married name. Her husband never had secured a divorce. Um, I'm not quite sure why. Dorothy, I think, was her middle name. And she had fake identity papers made, saying that she had been born in the Philippines to Italian parents. So she was just trying to insulate herself the best she could. But when she opened the Tsubaki Club, she started her own underground network, and the code name that she used was High Pockets. And that had to do, of course, with where she tucked valuable pieces of information in her brassiere or in her high pockets. So, okay, so the next slide kind of.
We just had a quick question from
Sure.
Scott there about did any of these people you're talking about, like Claire, did they speak Japanese?
No, and in fact, when Claire changed her identity to having Italian heritage, she didn't even speak Italian. I don't think she spoke Spanish. No, she didn't speak Japanese, but she tried to recruit people to work in the club who were multilingual because she was, I mean, one of the reasons for having the club was intelligence work. She wanted to hear what her Japanese customers were saying, and she wanted to be able to get that information translated and out to whoever could use that information.
I mean, Ivan Sordo, who's a regular viewer and in fact has been as a guest once, he's talking about his mum was in the Philippines at the time, and everyone knew about these clubs that were about gathering information and intelligence from the Japanese. So it's fascinating how these threads all combine. A viewer has a connection with this type of establishment. It's just fantastic stuff. Thanks, Ivan, for sharing that with us.
So the next slide shows a bit more about what she had in mind. While she had been on Bataan looking for Phil, she actually ran into another American soldier who had gotten separated from his unit in the 31st. And this was John Boone. We see him there on the right. This is taken after the war, of course, but he's there with Edwin Ramsey, who was also another noted American guerrilla leader on Luzon. And Boone had been the one to suggest to her to go to Manila and to gather information, to gather supplies. And so when she got the club set up, she got in touch with Boone and she said, okay, I'm up and running. What do you need? And that's how she operated then from the fall of 42 into 1944. So next slide. And this, I should say, this is a total photoshopped before there was photoshopping. This is not Claire Phillips in front of the Tsubaki Club. And you see it says National Archives. So somebody in the 40s actually did this, but this is Claire's head on somebody else's body, just to show you of kind of what the club looked like. And in early 1943, Claire actually moved. She too had been living with Diane in the Ermita district. She gave up her apartment. They moved into the club. She thought it would be safer given all of the curfews with the Japanese, and she just wanted to not be leaving Diane behind for so many hours every day, and especially with the night hours with the club. So she moved into there for safety, and she starts expanding her network. And here, I did find very clear connections between High Pockets and Miss U. They were using the same contacts. Claire also started working at the with the Irish priests, the same ones who were helping Peggy. All of this work overlapped. And even there was even one case where Peggy, Claire, and Gladys were all working on supplying the American prisoners at the Passay Elementary School on Park Avenue. They were all there at roughly the same time, and I just can't get over the fact that they must have literally been trying hard not to bump into each other. But they all knew about the need there. They were all trying to meet it. So their work did very much overlap. And the more need there was during the war, the more this work intensified. And into the spring and summer of 1943, Claire was working at a fevered pace, and she worked herself into physical illness. She was stressed out. I can't even imagine what this must have been like for her to be doing this work. She was stressed out to the point of physical illness. And so the next slide. By September of 1943, Claire lands in the hospital with a bleeding ulcer. I think she was probably in the Philippine General Hospital. She simply referred to it as the hospital. This would have been the most likely one. And she had a very long recuperation there. And one day she had a visitor, and the visitor was none other than Peggy Utinsky, who was making her rounds. Peggy was also, in addition to all of her underground work, she was still taking on some private nursing patients to help make ends meet, to keep her connections going, to keep the money flowing. And she knew Claire was in the hospital, so she stopped in to see Claire. And that was the day that the Japanese arrested Peggy Utinsky. They picked her up in the hospital. They had been following her for months at this time. They'd also been already looking more deeply into what Dorothy Fuentes was doing at the Tsubaki Club. The Japanese were not ignorant of what was happening in these places. So Peggy gets taken to Fort Santiago. We see it pictured here at the bottom. Everybody dreaded even speaking that name out loud, because that's where the Kempeitai did their questioning and their torturing. And accounts of this vary. Peggy says she was there for 32 days, and she was questioned and repeatedly tortured, and she absolutely refused to admit that she was not Rosina Utinsky and that she had nothing to do with any guerrillas or any underground work. She simply refused to admit it, and the Japanese let her go. Without a confession, they let her go, which sometimes happened, but oftentimes didn't. Now, there is also evidence that her release was the result of some bribes made by other members of the underground network who were well placed in the Filipino community, who had back channel ties to the Japanese. But she was able to leave the fort, but she was never the same again after that. In fact, it took her at least 6 weeks of recuperation in the hospital before she felt well enough, and she went right back to doing what she had been doing before, even though it was physically harder on her. The people who knew her thought she was probably on the brink of a total breakdown. She was known to be acting erratically. Some of the Miss U network members tried to distance themselves from her. They were worried for security reasons. But the network itself continued with or without her. The supply network continued. And Claire Phillips, too, after she was well and recuperated, she went back to the Tsubaki Club to continue her work. So the next slide. So the final unraveling came then in May of 1944. Margaret Utinsky was still doing her work in Manila, trying to lay low, though, trying really not to attract attention. The unraveling of these networks happened at Cabanatuan itself when the smuggling was discovered by Japanese authorities. These caribou carts brought the contraband into the camp. There was a major sweep of everybody who was involved in this smuggling operation. POWs were punished, and this is when the Kempeitai came for Claire Phillips. She was at home in her rooms behind the club, and they came, they got her. Diane stayed behind. Of course, she was just a child, but Claire ended up as a prisoner of the Japanese. She does actually spend some time being questioned and tortured, and she did admit to some work She was found guilty, I think, of aiding the Allies, and even though that carried a death sentence, she was actually sentenced to 12 years at hard labor at a women's prison just outside of Manila. So that's how she experienced pretty much the end of the war. So if we could have the next slide.
Yeah.
We're getting there. So by September of 1944, Claire is a prisoner. Peggy has had to leave Manila because she gets word from her contacts that the Japanese have another arrest warrant out for her. And she knows she has to leave the city. So she finds Diane Phillips. She finds Claire's little girl and takes her to John Boone on Bataan. And this is where Claire had wanted Diane to go. She had wanted Diane to go to Boone and his guerrillas. That wasn't possible to happen until Peggy showed up and said, I'll take her. And she did successfully make it to Bataan. She worked with, Boone gave her a battlefield commission. She was a brevet lieutenant. She nursed in different American guerrilla groups on the peninsula, waiting for what they knew would be the return of the Americans. So the next slide. And again, I mean, some significant time passes here. Claire's in jail for a long time. Yai is still with the guerrillas. Gladys is stuck in her compound in the Passé neighborhood. Peggy is nursing for the guerrillas, and then comes word of the American invasion at Lingayen Gulf in early January of 1945. And here, this time, this is an American victory. It's takes a while for that march down through Luzon to head to Manila. And I'm sure, again, probably a familiar topic, especially to those who've read The Great Raid. We know what happens as a result of that. And so I do just want to talk about what happens to our women as a result. We first saw what happened to them after Pearl Harbor. Now we'll see what happened to them after this invasion and American troops finally start heading into Manila. So our one of our last slides then is the next one. So what happens here? As American forces are making their way to Manila, they do liberate the prison that Claire is in. She's liberated, I think, on February 10th by American forces, and they take her and the other women to the grounds of the University of Santo Tomas, which had been liberated just a few days earlier. It was considered to be a relatively safe place. And here I have images of what the city of Manila looked like as a result. And again, Paul mentioned Rampage. We all know about how tenacious that battle was. But it's interesting that all four of these women were actually drawn back to Manila, knowing that it still was not quite secure. But the U.S. Army was close enough that they were willing to do it. So Claire goes, she's escorted along with the other prisoners, safely deposited at Santo Tomas, which was guarded by the U.S. military. She settles in there. She has to recuperate. She's in very poor physical condition, but very happy to be liberated. Yai in Rizal province also knows that the Americans are coming, and she uses their arrival in early 1945 in the province to get away from marking. He's extremely jealous of her around any men, and she finds some sympathetic American soldiers who help her get to Manila, and she is able to retrieve her children, and they also seek sanctuary at Santo Tomas. She finds out she still has some friends there, so she goes and she stays there for a few days. Peggy also gets word that the Americans are coming. She leaves Bataan. She takes Diane Phillips with her, and part of the way they're just together on horseback, meeting up with American troops heading into Manila. And she also ends up at Santo Tomas, where she has, for her, the rather heartbreaking duty of then turning over Diane to her mother. She was not quite sure that Claire had survived. Claire was probably not sure that Diane had survived, so it should have been a very heartwarming moment for all of them to meet. It wasn't exactly that way, but Peggy did leave Diane with her mother and then went off to work with the counterintelligence corps of the U.S. Army to help provide them with any information they might need about POWs and Japanese activities. And Gladys was caught in her Manila neighborhood. Her compound that she'd been living in had for a while been occupied by forces from the Japanese Navy, and she experienced much of that battle of Manila directly, and for days under bombardment, knowing that this street by street fighting was happening, until finally one day there was quiet, and she and her friend Dorothy Jansen looked down the street and saw a totally unfamiliar uniform, and then looking at the size of the men realized they had to be Yanks, and so they were safe. So she then also very quickly made connections with her friends through Santo Tomas and started helping them. She opened up a restaurant again in Manila as soon as she could, and started getting food to where it was needed throughout the community, but to especially to her friends. So I think we might be near our last slide.
Yeah, the last slide is the aftermath on the books. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what then happened to these women as the war ended? Well, it is interesting that three of them ended up on the same ship back to the United States. Claire Phillips, Peggy Utinsky, and Yai Panlilio were all on the SS Likes, I think it's pronounced. They arrived in the States in May of 1945. We see Claire there on the right. She and Peggy and Yai were all recipients of the Medal of Freedom, which was created in World War II to honor people living outside of the United States who had assisted the war effort. They all wrote books about their experiences. Peggy had a very difficult life after the war. She was never physically or emotionally the same. She was the first to get the Medal of Freedom. She wrote a book about her experiences called Miss You, and she did spend a lot of time staying connected with the veteran community. In fact, a few years ago when I spoke about Angels of the Underground, one of the men in the audience had met Peggy at a veterans hospital in Texas, I think in Texas after the war, and had some interesting stories about her. She stayed very much connected with that community. She never remarried. Her husband, Jack, had died at Cabanatuan. She never remarried. She was estranged from her only son, and she died fairly young in 1970, probably from some form of Alzheimer's. Claire Phillips had a very flamboyant post-war career. There was a lot of publicity surrounding her return. She was seen as very glamorous. She had had this nightclub that catered to the Japanese. She also wrote a book called Manila Espionage, which then was made into a movie called I Was an American Spy. So she had this sort of Hollywood glamour connection. She did remarry, and she could only do that after her divorce was finally finalized. Manuel Fuentes survived the war. Although she used the name Claire Phillips, she had claimed that she and John Phillips were married on Bataan. There was no legal marriage there. In fact, she was not divorced from Fuentes until 1947 when she remarried. She married a World War II veteran. But then there was another divorce. She was estranged from her daughter Diane. And she died in 1960 from meningitis. Yai came back to the States to try and get away from Marking. He followed her. She secured a divorce from her husband. They did get married. She and Marking got married. They returned to the Philippines. They worked together on guerrilla recognition programs to get compensation for the Filipinos who had helped the guerrilla movement. She ended up coming back to the United States, divorcing Marking, and she also died, I think, in the 1970s. Gladys Savary remained in the Philippines for a few more years. She ran a restaurant until the late 1940s. She returned to the States. She opened up her final restaurant in California. In the 50s, it drew a lot of former internees, veterans. A lot of people came to the new Gladyses. It was called Rammer Oaks. She led a very quiet, but it seemed a very happy life. She was also the most long-lived of all of these women, dying in her 90s in 1985. So I know I've gone a little bit over my hour.
And we have a few questions, but it's been
Sure.
absolutely spellbinding. People have loved it. So I'll start with the last one. So Willie Robertson is a regular viewer. And not necessarily about the four women you wrote about, but other women generally, because of these people being picked up. And you were talking about sometimes they're able to kind of just get away with things. But if they were released from interrogation, were they sometimes put under surveillance by the Japanese?
I think they were. And when I talked about the final unraveling in the spring of 1944, that whole all the caribou carts that were being brought into the camp, I think the Japanese had known about this for quite a while, and they kept tabs on it. And I think they also were getting some kickback from it. And at some point they just decided they'd had enough. It was time to round all of this up and, make some arrests and, do their best. And Claire and Peggy in 1943, I think they had a suspicion they were being watched. They tried to be as careful as they could, but, they're not experts. They had no training in intelligence gathering. They were just doing this to the best of their ability. They had to go on their gut. Did they think they could trust this person? And what they knew was that some of the Filipinos who approached them, they could be working for the Japanese, or they could be working for the Americans. They had no way of knowing for sure. They had to follow their feelings. Sometimes they were wrong.
And of course, during the course of the war, allegiances and change. It's not like we're talking about a few weeks. You may have been a family that was brave at one point of the war, but then your own personal circumstances, poverty, things change around you. Someone that was trustworthy might become untrustworthy, or the other way around. It's a constantly fluid situation. I always remind people, as I live in Normandy, that the attitudes of the French weren't the same as the war moved on. Their optimism changed, their confidence changed. So it's an ever-changing situation generally in these situations. So we'll do another question for you, which was you mentioned about being estranged from Diane there. So Ghost Will is asking, how did the children make out? Because you're talking about the women themselves probably suffering from PTSD and having difficulties after the war, but that can often extend to the children as well. So how did the children make out, and did you manage to speak to any of them or the next of kin?
I tried for a long time to trace Diane and came up with nothing. Now, of course, this is several years ago, and I don't know if somebody else has picked up on this too, and maybe there's been some new information, but I was never able to find anything beyond, like, say, the 1950s, maybe, when Claire was still alive. There was a scholarship set up for her at a college in Oregon. It doesn't look like she ever availed herself of it. She seems to have simply disappeared. Not
Wow.
and and again, I speculate on some of these things because at some point, the actual information runs out. I try not to get into wild speculations, but just into things that might have happened. And I think you're right. We look at how this affected adults, for Peggy, for Claire, but think about as a child, Diane first being taken to Bataan, and think about all of what was going on there. Then she's taken back to Manila, where it's safer for a while. But then she's back, in the back of this nightclub, and she must know that there's stuff. And then another woman comes and picks her up and takes her back to Bataan, and she's moving around with guerrilla forces. Now, Peggy was very, very concerned about Diane's welfare. And there were a couple of times where she switched her work locations based on what she thought was going to be the safest, and in terms of health conditions. Because there were concerns about Diane picking up diseases, getting food, what was going to be the healthiest and the safest for Diane. So Peggy was very conscious of that. But as a little girl, I think that all had to be extremely traumatic. And it probably contributed to her estrangement with Claire after the war. And I think that Diane may have tried to get in touch with Peggy after the war too, although I'm not sure about that. So yeah, a lot of really difficult consequences of this.
Definitely. We'll do one final question. It's from Sheila Hall is asking, what do you know about Florence Finch in the Resistance, and would the women mention have any connections to her? My apologies if this was discussed earlier and I missed it.
No, absolutely. And you may know already there is a book on Florence Finch. And I do include her in this book because absolutely, she was one of Claire's cellmates. They were imprisoned together, and one of the ways that I could and did try to corroborate the activities of Claire and Peggy was to look at other stories from other women who were in similar situations. So yes, the Florence Finch book, and I've got it right. I'm looking this way because I have it on my shelf here. I don't think I can grab it quick enough, but it's a great story. And Claire, when both women were in prison, both Claire and Peggy, they met up with a variety of other women who were imprisoned and tortured by the Japanese. Some of them were American, some of them were Filipino, some of them were like Florence and like Yai. Combination. They had, Filipino mother, American father. So yeah, and Florence Finch's story is really fascinating too. A woman who used her employment position during the occupation to help funnel information to American forces.
Mm. And my last question, which is a potential kind of difficult one to answer, really, is we talk a lot about when you said you weren't at the beginning, you're not a military historian, but at least military historians have war diaries, they have after action reports. There are ways of looking at paperwork that confirm dates, confirm movements. With stories like this, for women who are involved in things for such a long period of time, 4 or 5 years of work, there has been questions asked about the recollections of the dates and things. And Peggy's account particularly has been kind of scrutinized post the movie coming. How do you make that judgment call when you're researching this as to kind of where truth and faulty memory kind of come into it? Because you can't just pull up the archives of the resistance. These shadowy contacts didn't keep minutes of their meetings, and we met at the corner of the so and so street on the 23rd of July 1944. How do you go through that process of making sure it's factual?
Yeah, and that was the big challenge of this. And I know I looked yesterday at the Wikipedia entry for Margaret Utinsky, and it's really quite harsh, I think.
Yeah, it is very harsh. Yeah.
And I think really undeservedly so. Not that, and I find plenty to criticize about her, but to say that there's no corroboration of what she did, I think is a stretch, because I spent a lot of time in the National Archives looking through all of the files from um, uh, the men who were prisoners of war. And it would have been really easy to kind of say, oh yeah, she made all this stuff up. But I did find um, there in handwritten documents from the time, some of these prisoners noting, oh, this came through the Miss U network, and rumors are that Miss U is this, this, and this. So I think there was enough for me that I found in these papers to say, yeah, she was doing something. Okay, and what she was doing, she wasn't the only one. She wasn't flawless. She wasn't perfect, but she was doing something. And so I think to say that, yeah, she made this all up is not true,
It's
because
very
there,
harsh, and I think
yeah,
it's opening up the bigger question about women being less believed than men. We could talk about the rape cases in 2022, for example, if we want to go down that awful rabbit hole. But I think those memoirs that came out in the late 1940s, 1950s, I think it's fair to assume that if a woman wrote it, it's going to come under more scrutinization than if a man wrote it. And and if people think I'm being all woke by saying that, I do a lot of research, a lot of questioning things, and I think it's absolutely true. I think if a woman says they did this, people are going, well, prove it then. Whereas if a man says it, it must be true then. And that's a potential a big topic, but I definitely think there's something in that, unfortunately.
yeah. And it's just a couple of things. One is that not only from POW records, but also some of these guerrilla leaders. I mean, they did mention these women from time to time. It wasn't a focus of their reports or their diary entries, but they do show up enough where, yeah, I mean, Claire Phillips did these things, Peggy Utinsky did these things, and it was documented enough at the time. And also when you consider that despite all these stories and counter stories, both Claire and Peggy received medals of freedom.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And these were initiated by the military. So somebody was vouching for what they did. So you're right. I think you have to say, is this the same thing that men would have done, would have been capable of doing? Did they show the same kind of bravery and commitment? Well, maybe not, but even among the men, there were very, very different gradations of bravery and
Yeah.
commitment. So why take women to task for it unless you're
Exactly,
going to do
and
it?
it's about attitude. I mean, Alexandra Ritchie made the same point on Monday that resistance is about attitude. It's about wanting to do something, and judging it always by the net results is not necessarily the fairest way to do it. It's by what were the intentions, what were the attitude of these women. If you've told us one thing is these four women and the others that you cover in the book and others you mentioned, they all had the attitude of, I will do what I can to aid the war effort. I'm not going to bow under. I'm not going to just ignore this. I'm going to do what I can, whether it by feeding people or getting intelligence. And that I think is attitude. But to wrap things up, what are you working on next? Because I'd like to think you're working on some exciting new project.
Well, I have to whiff a little on this answer. One is that one of my most recent books on a scrappy woman was actually a Civil War
Yeah.
story. And then I went totally Hollywood for the even most recent book. And right now I am unexpectedly between projects. I'm still
Wow.
trying to figure out what my next one will be. Um, I don't know that it will be a war topic. I was so immersed in the Philippines for so long, and it was a very worthy topic, but it is it's a difficult one, I think, in many ways. And so I'm still thinking about what's coming next.
Well, either one can't wait, and I can't wait to find an excuse to bring you back on again because it's been absolutely enthralling. I've loved talking to you. I'm just going to take you off a screen for 1 second to remind me what we got coming up tomorrow, and I'll bring you back in a moment. So,
Okay.
folks, tomorrow night Megan Corman is joining us to talk about the Dutch Paris escape line. So another set of brave individuals, some women, some men, who are getting various people in need out of occupied Europe. So that'll be a fantastic show. We haven't really covered that angle before. And I've been in contact with Tessa Dunlop today. I will get her show on Friday scheduled as soon as I can, and it's going to be ostensibly about the burgeoning marriages that occurred during World War II using Elizabeth and Philip, my former queen and her husband, as an example of those marriages that happened after World War II. So that's something to look forward to. And then the Hurgan Forest Week starts on Saturday. Again, before I bring Theresa back in to say goodbye, if you haven't clicked the button to subscribe to our channel, then get on and do it as soon as you can. I would urge you to go and buy Theresa's book, the one we're talking about today, but also the others as well. All the links in the description below and her own website. But right now, I'm going to bring Theresa back in to say goodbye. And it's been fantastic. I've really enjoyed it. And so the audience. And did you enjoy talking to our bunch of individuals tonight?
Well, I really want to say a huge thank you to you, Paul, and your audience. It is a little bit difficult for me. I can't see any of you out there, but I
Well, you don't
really
want to see them, you know.
I really do appreciate all the time that you spent to listen to these stories, and not to endlessly plug my book, but one of the good things about it is I name so many other people who were absolutely essential in these operations. And so if you are interested in the broader story, I do, it's kind of a long book. So there are more people in there than just the four women I talked about. And I really did enjoy it. And I'm glad you all decided to spend some time here. And happy holidays to everybody.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Well, this is it then, folks. It's Paul Woodad for World War II TV saying I'll see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.